have to go, George. Off you go. Okay. George, our co-chair, is going to be facilitating this session. Thank you, George.
Okay, thanks very much, Barbara. Welcome, everyone. That's all. How many are there? Let me see. 103 people at the moment for this session. Thanks for looking in. The topic for this session is nature and imagination. And we're delighted to welcome two eminent speakers, Rob Hopkins and Bridget McKenzie. Rob Hopkins is founder of the International Transition Towns Movement and co-founder of Transition Town Totnes, and the author of numerous books, including, and I've got lots of them in my shelf here, there's one of them, and that one's The Transition Companion, Making Your Community More Resilient in Uncertain Times, and his most recent one, which is this one here, and that is From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want. In 2012, he was voted one of the Independent's top 100 environmentalists and was included in the Observer's list of 50 new radicals. Rob holds doctorates degrees at 3 universities. When he's not doing all this, he's a keen gardener, a founder of New Lion Brewery in Totnes, and director of Totnes Community Development Society, an ambitious community-led development project. Bridget McKenzie is founder and director of Climate Museum UK, a mobile and digital museum creatively stirring and collecting responses to the climate and ecological emergency. She's creative curator and consultant in regenerative culture as the force of hope in the face of the Earth crisis, and is dedicated to helping communities and cultural organizations grasp the reality of the crisis and react accordingly to change the world. Bridget has 30 years experience in running, developing and evaluating learning and digital programs in museums, heritage, arts and science, including at the Tate Gallery and the British Library. Just a little bit about the format of the session now and what's going to happen. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, after which you'll all be invited to go into breakout groups for a very short time, just 10 minutes this time, to discuss a topic which will appear in chat near the time. We won't put it up right now, or else you'll be thinking about it right now. So that'll come up later. Then after the breakout room, we're back to plenary for 30 to 40 minutes for questions, which you'll be able to put into the chat function. And throughout the whole of the session, you'll be on mute. The session will close no later than 3 p.m. when there'll be a 30-minute break before the next session. So thank you to Rob and Bridget. And if I could ask Rob to speak first. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Delightful to see you all here. I'm just going to share my screen because I want to show you some pictures to illustrate what I'm going to talk about. So can you see that? Does that work? And you can just see the main slides, yeah? Good. So hello, I'm Rob Hopkins, and it's my great pleasure to be with you today. And what I want to talk about is about imagination and some work that I've done over the last couple of years that led to the book that George mentioned. And I always like to try and start with a little bit of what Extinction Rebellion would call tell the truth in terms of where we're at right now. I feel like we are at the moment standing on top of this enormous mountain. And beneath our feet is more debt, more anxiety, more carbon, more plastic, more loneliness than we've ever stood on top of before. And the views are amazing for some, but the expert guides who are at our side are saying, we really need to get down off this mountain really, really quickly. Can you see the storm clouds that are coming in over there? We really need to get down off here. And for some people, that's enough. For some people, we're happy enough to say, right, you are then, let's get down off here really quickly. For a lot of people, I feel like actually a lot of what needs to happen right now, because as this drawing shows, if we had started in the 1980s, it would have been so much easier. And you know, if this was something that was going to be won by facts and figures and statistics, we would have done this in the 1980s. I feel, Deborah.
Sorry, Rob. One or two people are asking if you can put it into presenter mode because it'd be a little bit larger for them.
Presenter.
Is that possible? Thank you.
Like that.
Lovely. That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Deborah. So, so I feel like actually one of the key things that we need to be doing now is to be telling the stories about the lower slopes of this mountain, the valleys and the lowlands that wait us down at the bottom here. What's the welcome like that awaits us here? What's the food like? The celebrations, the welcome that awaits us there. How do we really bring to life for people what that would be like, so that we can create longing for that future? So much of my work, I feel, and the work that we need to be doing now around decarbonizing the world is around creating longing. And that's a piece which is around storytelling. That's a piece which is around imagination, rather than just facts and figures and policies. And for the last 13 years of my life, I've been really involved with the transition movement, which has been about how do we start where we are now as communities? What do we do with the people, the resources that we have? How do we start not just to tell those stories in the places where we are, but give people a very tangible taste of what that future could be like? And that can be from small things like community gardens and planting trees, up to really, really ambitious things, some of which I'll be talking about shortly. So I spent the last couple of years focusing on this question of imagination, because I kept reading people who I really admire, like Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, who kept saying climate change is a failure of the imagination. And it started to really get under my skin. I was thinking, why would we be having a failure of the imagination in 2020? And I've come to believe, and it's something that I set out in the book, that we have created a kind of a perfect storm of factors that are profoundly damaging to the human imagination at the very worst time we could possibly do that. We know that the human imagination needs space. It needs us to have our basic needs met, and it has various needs which we are absolutely not meeting. We recognize that in a population, if it doesn't have a sufficiently good diet, we see a rise of otherwise preventable illnesses. We recognize that if we have a terrible education system, then a population fails to reach its full potential. But just slightly out of our field of vision, our collective imagination is kind of shrinking under this sort of combined pressures. And I feel like it's really important that we put it back right in the middle of our conversations and say, this is really, really fundamentally important. What I encounter quite a lot in the work that I do is people who say, yeah, but that's never going to happen. And any of us who with friends who say, hey, maybe we could do this, maybe we could decarbonize by 2030. People go, yeah, probably too late anyway. And, you know, we encounter all of this. This is one of my favorite pictures from the US in the late 1960s, when you could take your car and park it on the beach. If you went to the beach, you could park on the beach. And so there must have been a time when that changed. And people were told, actually, you can't park your car on the beach anymore because it'd be so much nicer for everybody. And there must have been people then who said, I can't imagine not being able to park my car on the beach. And we encounter that all the time. But we now know that actually not parking your car on the beach is actually great. And so this thing of getting past that bit that goes, I just can't imagine, really, you know, this sort of poverty of imagination, because rapid change happens all the time. There are so many brilliant examples of change happening really, really fast. This is one of my favorite from the southwest of England in 1892, when over one weekend, over 2 full days, starting at 4 a.m. on Saturday, finishing at 4 a.m. on Monday, a team of 4,200 people laid 160 miles of new railway track. When we decide we're going to do something, we can move really fast, and we can move mountains metaphorically, if not literally. And part of that for me is that we need to be creating what I like to think of as memories of the future. How do we bring to life in people's imagining the kind of world that we create? The poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens, which is so beautiful. I'm going to say it again. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. This is an artist called James Mackay who draws the future. He lives in Leeds and he draws places in Leeds as they might be in a post-carbon future. This is his drawing of Leeds if it became the most biodiverse city in the world. If we set out right now to say in 10 years' time, Leeds is going to be the most I can't even say that word, biodiverse city in the world, what would it look like? It would look like this. And how do we bring that multi-sensory imagining alive for people? Many cities post-COVID are saying, how do we move beyond cars? If we were to do that and we were to get cars out of our cities and free up that space, what could we do instead? This is his drawing of, take up the tarmac. You fill those streets with gardens. Our children walk to school past food being grown. All of this is absolutely possible within the next 5 years, never mind the next 10 years, if we are to create a sufficient longing for it. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, it wasn't his idea. It wasn't JFK's idea in 1960. We had been going to the moon for decades before that, in songs, in stories. Tintin went to the moon. Frank Sinatra sang us to the moon. By the time we got to 1960, the longing to get to the moon was so intense that it actually took 8 years from scratch to work out how to get to the moon. And the average age of the team that got Neil Armstrong to the moon was 26. When we decide to do something and the longing is sufficient, the thing happens. So what I want to share with you today is something which I hope you will find useful in your organizations, in your movement, in projects that you're involved with. It came about through a friend of mine called Rob Shorter, who was a tenant in my house just when I finished writing the book. And he did his dissertation about the book. He had a manuscript of the book. And he created this model, which is just brilliant, and which we kind of jointly created just after the book had gone to be printed. So that's why it's not in the book. But we call this the imagination sundial. And for me, it's an attempt to answer the question: how could we rebuild our collective imagination? If we set out now and said, the deterioration of the collective imagination in this country has reached such a point that actually what we need to be doing is electing people who run on Make Britain Imaginative Again tickets, and you decided that was the key priority, where would you start? And there are 4 things, and I want to go through each of those and tell you some stories. So the first one is space. We all know in our lives, possibly you guys more than a lot of people, that having space for reflection in our life is fundamentally important to us being able to live an imaginative life. No one's best ideas came to them at 5 o'clock in the evening with an 8 o'clock deadline sitting in front of their laptop. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came when he rode his bicycle through the forest. And that space is disappearing so quickly out of our lives. The chief executive of Netflix recently said that their biggest competitor as a business was sleep. And we are seeing that space that we would otherwise spend daydreaming being eaten by overwork, by social media, and its disappearance is really important. And movements like the transition movement, like Extinction Rebellion, I think are really good at designing space into how they work. So every meeting is not just colleagues coming together with an agenda, it's friends who care about each other meeting to support each other, and designing space for celebration and for grief and for whatever is a really important part of this. In the transition movement, we try and do that on a community scale. This is just before lockdown here in Totnes, where we put on a big community imagining event, and those things happen so rarely. Those kind of what if spaces are so precious, where we come together well facilitated to say, okay, where do we go from here? So creating space is the first thing. And I think we need to be looking at things like a universal basic income, a 4-day working week, all as being part of a national imagination strategy. How do we help to bring space back into people's lives and to recognize that space is not equally divided, and there's a profound social justice aspect, as we've seen during COVID. The second one is place. And what I mean by place is places that you go where afterwards, when you go back to where you were before, you look at it in a new way. You see its possibilities in a different way. This is Waterloo Bridge. And my wife has been very, very involved in Extinction Rebellion. And she was there on Waterloo Bridge for the whole 2 weeks last April when Extinction Rebellion occupied that bridge, blocked it at both ends and turned it into a forest. And normally it's cars thundering backwards and forwards. For those 2 weeks, it was a forest with music. And many, many people who work and will go backwards and forwards every day would just stop and say, oh, this is so beautiful. Why can't it always be like that? And after you've seen Waterloo Bridge as a forest, it's very hard to unsee that. And it starts to change your sense, your expectation. This is in Paris, where there's a great transition group in the suburbs in Paris called Pré Saint-Gervais en Transition, who is starting a campaign not against something, but for something. They want to create a new urban forest. They do big marches through the area demanding a new urban forest, which they talk about as being a biodiversity strategy and an urban cooling strategy. I think it's also a really important imagination strategy. Putting forests back in places where don't expect it is just beautiful, like the work of this Austrian artist who just creates forests in really crazy unexpected places, like here in the middle of a football stadium, you know, creating these kind of pop-up things that start to shift our sense of how the future might be. This is a guy called Jason Roberts in Houston, Texas, does a project called Better Block. They go to places like this. Nobody loves this place. They talk to the people around. They say, what does this place need? What do you love here? And then they go back to their laboratory and they create stuff. And then one day they arrive at dusk and they work through the night and no one knows what they're doing. And the next day they've turned that place into this place and filled it with the kind of things that it could be in a more caring, more connected kind of a future. I like to think of it as being tomorrows, which is really what they're creating. And that doesn't need to be always that big and ambitious. This is a thing that I love from the US, started in San Francisco, a group of artists who got together to say, where can we find affordable exhibition space? Well, then somebody said, if you buy a ticket for a car parking space, do you have to put a car in it? Is there actually a rule, or could you actually just curl up in it and go to sleep if you wanted to, as long as you bought a ticket? So they started an event called Parking Day, where everybody goes down one day and they all buy a parking ticket and they fill those spaces with people doing yoga, with people playing games. They start little cafes, little gardens, different organizations come down. It's just fabulous. People get married in them sometimes. They do this. I have no idea at all what this is, but actually it doesn't really matter. They take a space people know well and they turn it into something else that starts to shift your sense of how this space could be in the future. And also when we're talking about places, we have, I think, perfected the art of designing awful and boring spaces. And one of my favorite people is a guy called Hundertwasser, who was a Swiss or Austrian, I think, artist and architect, who said, in former times, painters painted houses. Today painters have to invent houses and the architects have to build after the painting because there are no beautiful houses anymore. And I think the ability for the buildings around us to enhance or to deplete our imagination is really important. This is a thing that he did where he created the cancer department at his local hospital to take away all the corners and to turn it into somewhere completely different. This is the corridor that he created in the cancer hospital. This is an amazing development that he did, which is just there are no corners in all of his buildings on the ground floor. The floors undulate like this because he said when you go for a walk in the forest, it's never flat. It's not natural to have flat floors. So the buildings all kind of undulate. This is a house that he built in the middle of Vienna called the Hundertwasser house, where he said every house should primarily be a forest and a house second. And I think we so important need to be creating those places that we go to, and it just changes us on many levels. Sometimes those places can be whole towns, whole cities. This is in France, in a place called Ungersheim. One of the best examples of transition in practice I've ever been to. It's the place you go to where you can see how energy and food and local currency and local economy all weave together. And it's been featured in a film which has been shown all across France called What Are We Waiting For? These places, whether they're towns or cities, and with something that we try and do in Tonnes, that people come here to learn about transition and then they go home and they look at the place they've come from in a very different way. These places are so important and precious. So place and space are my first two. And my third one is practices. We need the practices that allow us to unlock people's imagination, and we have to start with a recognition that we are not all on a level playing field, that imagination to a degree is a function of privilege. When you are struggling and overwhelmed, it's very hard to live an imaginative life. This is part of your brain called the hippocampus, where your imagination fires from, and it's particularly vulnerable to cortisol, anxiety and stress. So when I was researching a book, I wanted to try and find a place where they were deliberately expanding the hippocampus, a kind of a campus for the hippocampus, if you like. And I went to Dundee to visit an amazing project called Archangel, run by Rosalie Summerton here. They work with people with mental health problems, with depression, with overwhelm, by using art. They say, when you walk through the door here, you're not a patient or a client, you're an artist preparing work for an exhibition. And every year they put on an exhibition in the biggest gallery in the city. And I spoke to so many people, and you could see how their imagination was starting to sort of expand back out again. And for me, the most powerful sort of indicator of the work they were doing was that every year they do an appraisal to see how well they're doing. They give the artist a piece of paper with 2 outlines of a human form. They say, fill the first one in to show how you felt before you came here, the second to show how you feel now you've been coming here for a while. And I looked through a pile of them, they were really moving. I just want to show you one that I think is kind of itself. And to me, this feels like what the shift to a low carbon future will feel like if we get it right. This is when we look at it holistically, this is really what we could create. So the first practice is that we need to recognize that a lot of people need a real leg up in terms of imagination. We need to create those conditions. This is a practice actually that Bridget was part of the last time we did this, called Transition Town Anywhere, where you take a big space between 100 and 400 people. You imagine that you're stepping into a future, not a utopia, but a future where we've done everything that we could possibly have done. And then you decide, then you think, well, what would I be doing in that future? And then you meet other people who share that interest. And then together you literally build it from cardboard and string and sticky tape and pens. You build a 3-dimensional living, breathing model of the future that you then spend the next 3 hours in, trading in, celebrating in, connecting in, grieving in, whatever. It's the most phenomenal. To be among 300 adults lost in a play world of their own creation is amazing. Last time we did it, these 2 young men here created a public transport system for Transition Town. This might look to you like a few cardboard boxes and a couple of chairs. They could tell you everything about this, the tickets, everything about it, where it went, what it ran on. As I say, Rilke said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And exercises like this are so powerful. Storytelling is not a practice we need to really master. This is a guy called Per Gronqvist who works for the Swedish government. His job title is Chief Storyteller. That's his role, and his job description is to bring to life the day-to-day realities of living in a post-carbon future. We need so many more chief storytellers. We all need the capacity and expertise to become those storytellers. And one of the key practices I think that we need is the ability to ask really good what-if questions. And in Liège in Belgium, the transition group there 6 years ago, came up with a brilliant what-if question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in this city came from the land closest to this city? So beautiful. And I went there for a big event where they first asked this question, and it was amazing. I went back last year, and in that time they created this project called the Liège Food Belt, and they have created 25 new cooperatives. They've raised 5 million euros of investment from local people. They started a vineyard, two vineyards, a brewery, which I had to go and visit. You know, we all have to make sacrifices. They started a farm. They started this shop called the Small Producers, which did so well. They now have 4 of them. I met the mayor of the city. He said, this is now the story of our city. Our role is just to remove all of the obstacles to this happening. But the beautiful thing for me is they got the what if question right. It was an invitation for people to look at the future in a different way, with an invitation to step in. And one of the things I've loved since the book came out is to see lots of communities who are starting to use what if as the narrative, as the framing for thinking, how do we move beyond COVID? How do we design for post-carbon future? This is in Northern Ireland, something that I'm supporting, where they've created what they call a coalition of the unexpected, who are using what if as the narrative to frame what comes next. In Bude in Cornwall. I did a talk for them recently, and they created all these beautiful what if graphics for Bude. What if more school time was spent outside than inside? What if car parks became play parks? What if birdsong drowned out the traffic? What if you know, they're just fabulous, and as a way of really opening up different possibilities. What if there was a daily imagination lesson? And this was the last one they created, which I thought was so beautiful, because it didn't even need to have all of the words, and it spoke to something which is a deeper kind of a longing in us, I think. And in Sweden recently, the Green Party ran an advertising campaign. This means what if in Swedish, where they took photographs of things already happening in Sweden, sorry, with this wording to say, yeah, what if this was actually what the future was? I love this one because it's not just about solar panels and carrots. It's about well-being, and it's about creating such a different economy. And this was my favorite one, which I think is just beautiful. So I'm aware my time is up almost, so I'm just going to give my very, very last one of these, which is pact, which might seem a weird word to use in relation to imagination. This woman here is called Gabriela Gomez Montt. She works for the mayor of Mexico City, where she has created with him a department which was conceived of as being a ministry of imagination, which sounds like something from a Harry Potter book. They actually have it in Mexico City, and their role is to look after the well-being of the imagination of the city. And the idea of pacts came to me from Bologna, where in Bologna, the municipality created something called a civic imagination office. They have 6 of them all around the city in response to a kind of an ongoing decline of involvement in democracy and civic things within the city. So they run big visioning exercises. And at the end, when they come up with an idea and the community come up with ideas, the municipality say, great idea, let's make that a reality. Okay, we can offer this, this, and this. You can offer that and that, good. Let's make a pact. And in the last 5 years in Bologna, they've made 500 pacts, from small little things to really big things, taking old office blocks over and turning them into schools to train kids as classical musicians. For me, there is something so important in our society now where our imaginations, on the rare occasions when they are invited, are marginalized, ridiculed, sidelined, that we need to meet it in the middle. If we invite the imagination, we absolutely need to meet it in the middle and create pacts. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And in a minute, when Bridget's talking, I'll put a link in here to an article I wrote about the Sundial, where you can download it and you can find out much, much more about it in practice. And I don't have time for that. If you want to find out anything else about me, robhopkins.net is where all of the interviews that I did for the book, you can find them there in full. Transitionnetwork.org is where you can find out what's happening in the transition movement near where you live. And I run a podcast called From What If to What Next. Listeners and subscribers send in what if questions. I find the 2 best people to journey. You would be most welcome. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rob. I feel that we need to just take a breath and go off for a few days to process those fantastic ideas. Just wonderful. And I'm sure those will form in questions towards the end of this session. They're already mounting up. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over to Bridget now for her talk. Thank you very much, Bridget.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, everyone. I think I'm going to complement Rob's wonderful talk by going in more detail into how our organisation, Climate Museum UK, enables more practice of the imagination in the face of the Earth crisis. So I'm going to share my screen now, but I just wanted to point out that I'm sitting in my little studio of Climate Museum UK in London, surrounded by props, and I just wanted to show you this one in particular before I disappear in sharing my screen. So for example, we collect and make all sorts of objects that are used for creative climate conversations, and that was just a banner about the imagination. But I'm just going to share my screen now and go into slide mode. Okay, present. So Oh, I'm at the last slide. Hang on a sec. I'm just going to escape and go to the top. Present again. Okay, so I'm going to talk about cultivating an echocentric imagination and what we do in Climate Museum UK to help with this. So I'll talk about what kind of museum we are, about being imaginative, about being echocentric. I'll also talk a bit about the concept of being positopian, which is about how we think about the future. And then in conclusion, I'll talk a little bit about what is an echocentric imagination. So we are a mobile and digital museum that is stirring and collecting contemporary responses to the Earth crisis. So although we look back in time and enable people to think historically, and we look forward into the future, we are collecting and listening to people responding to the changing planet right now. And just for example, here's another prop. So we use objects in a very live and active way. So this is in the collection. It's a dump trub mug, but I use it when I'm having Zooms and, you know, try and convey messages with it. So we're not like a normal museum collecting for a long history, you know, putting things in boxes and only to be touched with gloves. We're a team of creative people. So more than being a building with objects, we're more about the people that run it. Based in the UK, we're all passionate about the planet, and we produce and gather art, objects, ideas, games and books. I've got 200 books around me. Part of my background is working in the Tate. The other part was working as head of learning at the British Library. So I'm very much into that intersection between books and images, books and art. So we use these things in activations that help people play, make, think and talk about the Earth crisis and open up their imagination. And you can see we've got 6 principles here: planet kind, intersectional, compassionate, holistic, participatory, and positopian is really the principle that is about being imaginative, and I'll come to that in a minute. So what we do is we run workshops and pop-up displays. We also do online collecting projects and campaigns. We run training for organisations in how they might engage with people around the Earth crisis. We don't run sustainability training. We're very much about how to engage with people. We're open to partnerships to develop projects. And one of our tools is a print it yourself exhibition. So rather than travelling on transport, we provide resources that people can print themselves and to put up displays in their own venues. We are, our story of change is geared around the medicine wheel, which is thinking about the dimensions of life in terms of mental, physical, spiritual and emotional. And so we think about how we might achieve change. We're aiming to change systems, to shift values, and then looking back at the past, we're hoping to encourage people to think about justice and to make reparations. And that's essential for then looking forward to the future to create a more just and sustainable future. I'll just let you see the other points on the compass. I won't read through them all, but I just want to point out the importance of honouring Earth and ancestors, connecting to all beings and supporting grief. And these are areas maybe that museum programmes tend not to venture into. They tend not to venture into these more spiritual areas of work. I'm not saying they don't have the potential to, but they might not use those languages. They might not say that spiritual goals are important to them. I have sort of creed. I have to just sort of quickly run through some of this. So we don't just deal with climate. Climate is a big factor, but we really want to talk about the connections between climate and other dimensions. We are in an Earth crisis that includes both a climate emergency and an ecological emergency, and they're entwined. So COVID-19 is not a separate thing. It shouldn't really be diverting us away from the Earth crisis, because it has arisen from the ecological emergency. We say that the carbon footprint is only a part of your ecological footprint. Climate mitigation is important, but we also have to adapt to the Earth crisis. So I won't read through the rest, but it's really about understanding that our work is about expanding the imagination, or expanding the frame, so that we're not limiting our thinking about climate as a technical or carbon related issue. It's all about justice and health, and also there isn't an argument, there shouldn't be an argument. If you look at the last point here, modelling change in your own realm and catalysing and demanding change beyond it, there shouldn't be an argument about whether climate action is about personal small actions or whether it's about systemic political change. It's about both. So we have to imagine all of these things and more. Oh. So we are, as a team, as a museum, we're a community interest company, and we're a team of activists and artists who work across the UK. So we are a distributed, placeless museum in a way, but we do, the benefit of that is that we can work with our communities in places, and it reduces our footprint because we don't have to travel. I work a lot in my locality of Lewisham. This shows how we work together these days, meeting on Zoom, because we're distributed across the UK, and we try to be creative. So on one occasion, we all put animal masks on, and we tried to imagine, if we were animals, what would we be like as curators? So we're actually developing a project called the Wild Museum, where children will meet us as animal curators. So that's why we were doing that. And also, young people are a very important audience for us, but they're also important in our team. We have several associates who are young creatives, and I wanted to mention them because they bring to us a fresh imagination. And also I'm finding that young people are increasingly interested in the interspecies imagination. You know, how does a cat feel? You know, it isn't just about humans living in the world. We have to actually decenter ourselves and imagine what it is to be other beings. So McKenzie does animations that are all about being in other worlds, inside wild nature. Erin Ross makes sculptures where she uses taxidermied animals, ethically taxidermied animals. Eleanor Ross is a product designer working with us, who is rethinking objects and how we might interact with materials. So yes, young people are very important to us. A lot of us are artists, so our practices are artful, embodied and situated. So when the COVID-19 crisis hit, we wanted to carry on doing things in the physical world. So we ran a week of acts of tree kindness. And so we gave people lots of ideas of how they might go out on their walks every day during lockdown and care for trees. And also, being imaginative is not just about imagining the kind of wonderful solutions that Rob was talking about, but we also have to imagine how other people feel, how people feel in the global south, who are affected primarily, who are affected more than we are by the Earth crisis. We have to imagine how trees and plants feel. We have to imagine how people feel when they've lost nature that they love. This is the maybe already famous image of somebody grieving the loss of a tree due to HS2. So we run projects where we encourage people to express their experiences, to share their stories of living in a time of extreme weather. And we use objects and art to help people express their climate emotions. We're talking with psychologists about how people feel, how they might develop more productive emotions and what their coping strategies might be. But we think it's really important to help people simply express their emotions and sit with them. And so using art, very simple art activities to do this. And so just moving on to this idea of being Positopian. So this is an example of a project, a film by The Intercept, which is a message from the future. I'm sure Rob has seen this. It came out last week, I think. The artist Molly Crabapple paints multiple scenes of a possible future that is narrated, and the scenes vary from being difficult. You know, there are images and problematic stories in this film, but there are also beautiful evolving possibilities. So being Positopian is about widening the cone of the possible future. This is a classic way of imagining or seeing the shape of the future. It's called the Voros cone, and the widest extent is the possible. But in a time of Earth crisis, the possible is much wider than this. It's much worse, and it's much potentially better than this. So our activities are really trying to get people to expand the cone of the possible future. And people, so being Positopian is the most imaginative you can be. And we hope that this would help people overcome arguments between whether the future is dystopian or utopian. So just moving on briefly, and I'm not timing myself, which is probably a mistake. I think I have 5 minutes left. Being echocentric. So this is a familiar diagram, but it's a really good image to show that echocentric is actually about being a part of nature, knowing that we are nature and not dominant over it. It isn't denying the needs of humanity. And I like this quote from Beth Savin on Twitter. Hey, what if we acted like the world was an interconnected whole? So being echocentric is not just about how we think and imagine, it is actually about acting. We have to act like the world was interconnected in order to encourage people to imagine that it is. So we have to model that interconnection. And of course, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, and most people imagine them as they appear on the left in these separate logical boxes. But what if we could rethink them so that we frame them more echocentrically, with the biosphere goals much more important and fundamental? So this is another extension of our medicine wheel framework. And this is a list of ways that are showing how we are separated from nature, how we've become separated from knowledge of materials, from our observation of weather, from our concept of common ownership of land, separated from our ancestors, separated from an understanding of the connection of all beings and elements. And you go around the wheel and there are many other types of separation. And so our education approach, our approach in working with people, is towards connection, reconnection. So for this, we need not just eco-literacy, that's a familiar term you might have heard of, but we need eco-capacities. So capacities is broader than just literacy. We need in education or in our cultural programs or in our spiritual work, we need to work with people to re-establish that connection, working around these domains of literacy, of science, of our bodily skills, like the image of those young people watering plants, of our ability to make and imagine and construct things, our ability to know the traditions and rituals of people, and really to cultivate a holistic understanding. So my understanding of spirituality is that it is a practice of holistic understanding. And also another way of seeing it is that we are here's a matrix way of seeing it, where there's the anthropocentric history. You know, we've been really geared to being very human-centric, and we've been very, very logical and denotative or mechanical. So most of society, education and work are up in that narrow corner. Environmental science and climate campaigning is moving across to the echocentric world, but still very logical. The arts and culture are in that heartfelt space of being very poetic. But what if we all moved together? What if we all connected together and moved more across to that echocentric and poetic imaginative corner? So let's cultivate an echocentric imagination together, working across beliefs, across our disciplines, to, well, declare emergency. I forgot to mention I'm involved in Culture Declares Emergency, a new movement of arts and culture declaring a climate and ecological emergency. And when you declare emergency, you don't just rest with the statement, you take action to stop harm and help communities adapt to inevitable continued harm. We need to think as nature. We need to engage with body and emotions before we can start really imagining and using our minds. And we believe it's important to use objects and imaginative means for open-ended conversation between communities. So that's the end of my talk. I hope I haven't talked too long, and here are some contact details. I'll stop sharing now, and I believe we need to tell you about the breakout groups. Shall I carry on talking about that?
Yes, that would be good.
Okay, so there will be a 10-minute breakout where you get to talk to each other, and Rob and I were asked to set you an imaginative task, and we're going to ask you to introduce yourselves, but not as you are now, but as you are in the future, in a few years, when you have, you know, when things have happened, transformative things have happened because of your agency. So I'll start and model this. So I'm Bridget, it's 2030, and I've become known for revolutionizing museums so that they are agents for activism in the face of the Earth crisis. And Rob suggested that we also get you to think of an object that embodies this. So the object that embodies this for me is that I invented a device that is as famous and popular as the Rubik's Cube, and it's a conversational device for helping people understand all of the systemic connections between the impacts, the causes and the solutions to the Earth crisis. I don't know if Rob needs to say what he'll be famous for in a few years' time, or but
yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that. Well, I was thinking, ideally by 2030, the work of the transition movement and all of the work at the moment of going around and promoting and speaking about the transition movement, I won't have to do that anymore, because it will be such a kind of mainstream idea, and it'll just underpin everything in terms of how society and education are now organized, that maybe my object is a deck chair that I can sit in and take a little break at that point. Yeah. Made from beautiful local harvested coppice timber from a wood near me and reclaimed canvas.
I should say as well that some of you may feel like what's more important is maybe your grandchildren or children, so you might want to introduce yourself in relation to what they achieve in future, so that's up to you. So I'll mute myself now, and you'll be able to go into breakout rooms.
See you on the other side.
Hi, George. You should have
I know.
gone off to a.
No, I did go off, but I thought it would be a better idea to. There's so much to talk about, you know.
Oh no, but you should have. No, your George, your breakout room was with Rob and Bridget.
That's correct. I've just been in it, but I decided to leave it and leave them to get on with talking about sharing stuff, you know,
Yeah,
rather than me hanging around. So
that's fine. That's fine.
Nobody was in my room.
Oh, I've just moved you to another one, Deborah.
Oh, that's fine. Okay.
That's fine. I mean, there wasn't enough facilitators. That's why I used.
I'm actually very relaxed not to be in anything. I'm quite tired. I'm just going to have just a moment, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Excellent. Gosh, what an excellent session,
Yeah.
don't you think?
yeah,
Really good. Really, really good.
yeah, and it's
Yeah, well,
it's wonderful. It seems to me wonderful having listened to Frankie and Paul earlier as well, and then with Bridget and Rob. And you tend to think of, well, reimagining. I mean, is there going to be lots of overlap and so on? There isn't really. There's a coherence. They're all talking in a sense about the same concept. But they're all coming, and it kind of fits together, doesn't it? They're coming at it from different directions. And I just thought it was inspiring. Yeah, it's great.
It's amazing. It was interesting because I think it was Jonathan last night who said, you know, it's sounding a bit gloomy, because I think it was a little bit, you know, people were just talking about all the issues. And I rang a friend last night. I didn't know she was coming, and I saw her on the thing, so I rang her afterwards. I've known her for years. Well, we were at university together. And she said, yes, it was a bit gloomy. You know, she was wondering where the hope is. And I said, I think what people were doing, remember, going way back to some Greek Christian weekends I've been on, we need to get it all off our chests first. And then that opens up a space for us to say, okay, now we can start thinking about the future. And I think that's what's happening today.
yeah.
I don't think she's here today, sadly. I think she had some teaching commitments, but I said, if you come back on Sunday morning, you may find there's a completely different atmosphere. I hope so.
Yeah.
It seems to be very, I think that's what's happening. I think a lot happened last night, and then there's this incredible, I mean, today, huge stuff going on, really
Absolutely.
huge.
I'm just looking at the chat Google document. There's a comment by Claire and 3 comments from me. Just they're not in the form of questions. They're, you know, they will form in questions.
Yeah.
And Rob and Bridget too. Yeah. Hi. That's great. That's fantastic. Okay, well, you'll be delighted, or perhaps not. Maybe you'll be disappointed that we're not going to do a plenary session on feedback from your groups. But I hope that was really, really good for you. I'm just putting this onto the speaker. There we go. This is the time now for questions, and there were just so many ideas thrown up by both Bridget and Rob. And I wonder if you haven't already started doing that, think of some of the questions that you might want to ask them, some of the comments that you might want to make, and put them into the chat function. And we're trying to sort of gather themes, and we'll put that to Rob and Bridget. We have almost half an hour. We've probably got about 25 minutes. So that would be great if we could do that. I'm just going to kick things off by maybe asking a question myself, and that's about how we kindle that imaginative fire, which is so wonderful in the examples that both of you talked about. How do we kindle it in communities across the whole of the country? How do we take it into other communities within the UK? And it's a very difficult time, isn't it? Because people are suffering so much from austerity and COVID. How do we break that into? How do we share it and get people really involved in this? Or perhaps we are already. And maybe I could just put that to either Rob or Bridget?
I have an instant answer, if that's okay, just to dive in. And I just want to, the word trust comes to mind. And I think that people will be gravitated to, will gravitate to or connect with those organizations or networks that they already trust and know. And so I wouldn't want to try to create some big sort of branded program. There are already so many hundreds of transformational programs, but what we need is to encourage a joining up around a more echocentric, positopian imagination, and to use the trust around museums or schools or mutual aid groups, for example, and to give people the tools. And I think that Rob's tool of, you know, the basic idea of asking what if is just brilliant. It's like a seed, you know, a seed starter for this transformation.
Thanks, Bridget. Rob, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I would say that actually this time of COVID, you know, obviously has had many impacts that have been horrendous. But I also think they've opened, I feel like, you know, when we visit the Climate Museum in 10 or 15 years, when we have achieved, when we become a kind of a zero carbon nation by 2030, and we look back and we tell that story, that we will, the time of COVID will have been a key kind of levering point in that conversation. You know, what this time has taught us is that when governments decide to, they can sit down with scientists and listen to the best science available and make decisions based on the scientists saying this is an emergency, we need to act really quickly, and the politicians will say, yeah, don't worry about the money, we'll find the money, this is really important, and we can change things really, really quickly. You know, it's shown us that the economy as it's currently configured begins to collapse very, very quickly when we just stop selling stuff that people don't need to people who are over indebted in order to raise the money to buy it in the first place. That model is fragile and frankly kind of redundant now. It shows that people are capable of organizing, as we've seen in the last week with the incredible responses in terms of this government refusing to feed children during half term. That communities can organize and do extraordinary things, not that they should have to, but that organizing capacity is there. It's shown us that it's completely possible to reduce pollution massively. And it's shown us that we had that period of time where I talked about space. You know, those first few weeks of lockdown, we saw the most, it was a kind of a collective pause. And during that time, people had space. People started writing the novel they'd always wanted to write. They started doing online art classes, all those videos of families doing all these complex dances and dressing up like old masters' paintings. You know, we had a taste of, I often do an exercise with groups where I invite them to imagine that they're stepping forward into 2030, into a 2030 that was the result of us doing everything we could possibly do. And I've done it like as a time machine exercise with groups of 10 people and with 1,500 people in a hall in Belgium. And every time the main things are the same. People say, the bird song is so much louder. There are so many less cars. The air just smells delicious. There's a really strong sense of collective purpose. And actually, for ages, I would do that exercise, and then people leave afterwards and go, "Well, that was nice," but you know, in the real world, we had 2.5 months where that was our daily reality, and no planes going overhead. And I feel like, you know, what we have seen is a lot of the opinion surveys that have been done with people show that many people want to move forward to a different world than the one that we left behind when we went into this. And imagination and asking what if, as Bridget says, is going to be fundamental to how we're able to do that.
Could I just make another quick little point I forgot to make, which is about diversity and how, rather than just going into locality, it's also really vital to open up and invite voices or listen to voices from other places, other times, you know, even if, you know, use the imagination to understand different experiences and bring in, you know, acquired expertise, you know, the voices of Indigenous people, And yeah, if you're going to do things locally, always expand from that, always bring in others.
Thanks very much, Bridget and Rob. Just looking at the many questions coming in, we can't ignore politics, can we? And I know, Rob, you talked about politicians. Here's a question. How do we get Conservative MPs to imagine that there is an alternative to free market capitalism that really works? How can we do this? Because in a sense, you know, this is the terrific opportunity to do it right now, isn't it? I think everyone kind of agrees that, but it's not. How confident are we that the government are actually going to take this opportunity to truly accept a green agenda? Is it going to take a change of government, or do we have time?
Shall I start? I'm not. I don't want to be making party political points, because, you know, I certainly in the transition movement as such is determinedly non-party aligned, because it's something that works at the local scale. So, you know, it's open to people from all different political persuasions. I feel like the last election we had a very clear choice between one party that had a 2030 zero carbon target and a Green New Deal, and another party that really isn't really that bothered, and somehow people chose the other one, and that was such a vital kind of fork in the road. It's really hard, because, you know, we are living in a time with politicians who are completely shameless and who operate in a way where, however bad they are, they seem to just sort of keep going from strength to strength. I guess my own perspective has been that we absolutely need a kind of big, bold, beautiful yes, which is what we try and do in the transition movement and in other movements, which is based on saying, okay, we're not going to wait for you anymore. This is not a question of me trying to convince you. This is me telling you something phenomenal is going on here. There is a big shift going on here. There's a party going on over here. You can be part of this, or you can ignore it. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you what's already happening, and to share those learnings and to share those insights and to create stuff that are just so brilliant. Like in Liège, I think that story I mentioned in Liège. In Liège, the municipality were nothing to do with that project for the first 5 years. It was driven by people in the community. And in the end, it got to such a scale, and it was internationally recognized, that the municipality were like, oh, how can we help? You know, and if those people in charge are going so headstrong in the other direction, we have to work on building what we can. At the same time, we also need a big and bold, beautiful no. And the culture declares that Bridget talked about before is one beautiful example of that. Extinction Rebellion, the 350.org, the Sunrise Movement, the school strikes for the future. You know, this is a time where the window of opportunity to avoid exceeding 1.5 degrees is so tiny, but it is still there. And that film, there's a film that Bridget mentioned, which was created by the LEAP organization in the US and Canada, which is called The Years of Repair. I'll try and find the link and put it in here for everybody. Is the most beautiful imagining of what the next 10 years would be like. If the next 10 years were the time that turned this around, were a revolution of the imagination around the world, like 1968 times 100, where we filled the streets and the old institutions that were no longer appropriate faded away and new things emerged in their wake. It would be a time so extraordinary that future generations would sing great songs and tell great stories about that extraordinary time. And what that film does beautifully through art and animation and storytelling is to tell how that could be. And yeah, of course, there are times that'll be really painful, and it'll be hard, and there'll be grief and letting go of things, but also the exhilaration of building what comes next. I think, you know, my hope is that the election in the US next month produces an absolute landslide away from Trump. And I think when we start to see that, we'll see then the knock-on of that in different places. That sort of withdrawal of support for a kind of populist politics will then ripple around the world and hopefully create new openings for different things.
Thank you, Rob. Another question. This is.
it'd be nice to hear what Bridget had to say on that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, Bridget.
Yeah, well, I'll be quick. So I want to suggest some actions that could be taken. I agree with the notion of a great big yes, but there are things we can do. One of them is to campaign for an ecocide law. One of them is to campaign for proportional representation. If you're in the Labour Party, encourage them to support it, for example. The other is to campaign against the dominance of Rupert Murdoch and his ilk in the media. And the other is to take action on corruption in politics, for example, supporting the Good Law Project as they take our government to task on their corrupt handling of contracts and the National Health Service. So in our community interest company, we're not supposed to be political, so I've suggested 4 things that are not party political, but they will make political change.
Thank you. Question here. How would we infuse older congregations to think these things matter? Perhaps, well, maybe I'll widen that. How do we infuse the older generation, perhaps I'm in that myself now, to think these things matter, because I can see working in schools, working with young people and so on, and is a great way to involve people. What about older people? Any thoughts on that, either of you?
Yes, it's true that in our work we've focused quite a lot on young people and youth climate justice, and a lot of young people express sad or angry views about how older people have stolen their future and voted for Brexit and so on. And I'm keen really to build on that, to increase intergenerational dialogue and understanding. So I think that rather than trying to message at older people, it's about expanding their bubbles, and that's difficult in times of COVID because their bubbles have shrunk to the extent that some older people have almost no contact with others. But how to increase the interaction with younger people who can give witness statements, tell them what they're feeling about their stolen future. So there's maybe a fundable project in that. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rob.
I mean, a lot of transition groups that I visit, there is often quite a good representation from from older people there who have time and who want to share some of their skills and their energy in terms of supporting transition to move forward. One of the things, a friend of mine in Portugal who does transition there, they did a project which was bringing together older people to share their stories. They're the people who have the memory that goes back so much further in terms of they can see firsthand the changes that we are all talking about. So when I say during my lifetime we've lost 70% of the species, the plants and species that we share this planet with, I have some kind of memories of that, but it's not, but people who are older can remember the windscreen covered in bugs, and they can remember the swarms of the birds. They can remember how many butterflies there were, and they can remember, my father, when he passed away, he left photos in 1962 of the last time the River Thames completely froze over, and people riding their bicycles on a frozen river. They were mad, but all of that kind of stuff. And so to be able to use those memory to really tell the story of how climate and ecology has been changing over that time, I think is a really important part of this too.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm just looking at some of the comments that are coming in as well. That comment about older people is an interesting one, because a number of people are saying, well, it's not about the older people, it's about the people in the middle who are neither young or, the middle-aged people who perhaps. But you know, it's about all of us really, I guess. I wanted to come into another thing which was mentioned about the climate and ecological emergency bill, which is coming up. How do we, I'm just reading from the question, how do we raise that bill into the public imagination so that it becomes irresistible? That's the bill that's now going to be raised, I think, in Parliament in April. Any thoughts on that?
Well, in Culture Declares Emergency, we are thinking about how the artists and cultural organisations can support it, but quite often as publicly funded bodies, they're not allowed to advocate for specific political actions. But you know, how can their work in declaring emergency make climate and ecological action seen as essential? You know, post Brexit, how can cultural organisations help us see the connections between, for example, food being held up at the borders and the way that the climate is affecting our access to food as just one of many possible issues. So, of course, individual artists might feel much more able to directly ask for support from the public and politicians for the bill. But yeah, it's a difficult problem for organisations who can't be political.
Okay, thank you, Bridget.
I think the climate and ecological emergency bill is a really thrilling prospect, and you know, at the moment it doesn't look like it has much chance of actually being made into law. But then the Climate Change Act that we have at the moment, that was passed in 2008, 2009, didn't look like it would either, and so I think the main what happened with that was there was a massive campaign of kind of groundswell campaign that got backbench MPs to put their name to it, and I think we need to do the same thing. So I think we should, you know, where we are, be identifying the 10 or 20, because, you know, if as Extinction Rebellion or as environmentalists we write to our local Conservative MP and say, please support the climate and ecological emergency bill, it's kind of what's expected and doesn't really have that much of an impact. If we are able to identify the 10 or 20 organisations where we live who, if our Tory MP receives a letter from them, is going to go, oh, okay, I better listen to these people. I don't know, the local angling association or the local hunt or whatever, you know, we should go and talk to those people and say, will you put your name to this and support this? And then if our MP then gets a deluge of letters from those people, and, you know, I would imagine that actually that religious congregations would actually have a really interesting role to play in as being one of the people to do that, then I think it starts to get really interesting. Because what a climate and ecological emergency bill would do would be to basically declare a climate and ecological emergency on a national level and act as though that was the case. And that is absolutely the thing that we need to be doing now, and it's not going to happen from this government in any other way than this bill passing. So for me, I think that it's really an invitation to us to reach out and connect with people we never normally reach out to and talk to, and identify, you know, what is it about climate and ecological emergency bill that would serve what they do. You know, how are you going to keep fishing when there's no fish left in the river because there's no insects for the fish to eat, and the river is you know, warmed by X degrees? You know, come on, you need to get this. Then that's how we might get this thing passed.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Rob. Just thinking about some of the comments that are coming in are theological comments as well, and maybe just I'll raise a couple of them, really just to share. Jesus was a master storyteller, all those parables. How could the church tell a better story about the future? I don't necessarily need you to answer those questions. I just raised up there. One of the things that was mentioned, I think, by both of you is the importance of art in all of this. And I think so many people, certainly in Green Christian and elsewhere, are just finding it very difficult to articulate their deep feelings about the ecological emergency. And for some of those people, they're able to articulate it in the form of poetry and in the form of art. And in fact, we have now an arts convener, and a whole page in our, several pages on our website are for people to put their art up there and tell their poems and share them and so on. So I think that's interesting, because storytelling in art has been a major feature, I think, of what you've both been talking about. Let's see if there are any other particular questions.
Maybe I could just say one thing on that. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Bridget,
go
you were
ahead.
about to speak.
Yeah, you go.
Well, just that, you know, my experience, in terms of storytelling, is that when I would do talks that would be predominantly, you know, the first 15 or 20 minutes, I would be showing graphs and of how awful everything is, and all the graphs with all the lines going in the wrong directions. You know, physically people lean back, you know, and as soon as you start stories about people like them in places like where they are, who were doing stuff and what happened, and then that led to that, and, you know, people lean in. We are a story, as the book Sapiens says, you know, the thing that distinguishes human beings is we are the storytelling species. And I try to, I think I try to do as much storytelling in the talks that I do as possible. And I think that in many ways, the transition movement, we always say to communities, all the resources are free, there's no annual membership. Main thing is that you share your stories, and it's, in many ways, it's a kind of a network of story of what people are doing. And I think to invite people to reflect and to use art and poetry and storytelling as a way of building on, of going deeper into this stuff and expressing what's going on. Because, you know, when you, as the ecologist Aldo Leopold, one of the very first ecologists, said, you know, to live with an ecological understanding of the world is to live in a world of wounds, something like that. And it can be pretty lonely sort of a place. So to find ways to express that is really powerful, particularly if we can do it with other people.
Thanks, Rob.
I just quickly wanted to make the point that art might not be as effective as we think in communicating messages, but what is needed is for people to actually participate in art. And art has so many dimensions. So the attitudes of, you know, there are many different forms of art, and people need practice in many different forms. We need to have lots of different modes of being and expressing, you know, including grief and ecstasy and, you know, the kind of oracular mode of unconscious expression. You know, all of these are routes to better well-being and better connection with other people. So also, you know, the role of culture to enable dialogue and understanding. And so, you know, it's all art is mostly really about bringing people together and isn't just about communicating and educating.
Thank you very much to both of you. I think we're almost out of time, and it's just been a complete and utter pleasure to have both of you here. It's been great, and you've given us more than enough to think about. And the thing about art, I'll just sort of mention something. I've been reminded that we're setting up during this weekend an arts challenge, and if anyone would like to respond creatively to what's happening this weekend in the festival, we'd like to invite people to show their paintings, their drawings, model or photograph, or write a poem on the theme 2020, signposts and barriers to the promised land. There may also be an opportunity for, if you know, to actually have that in the final session on Sunday. If you're a Green Christian member, you can also submit your work to the arts convener, and that would go onto our website. So just finally, thank you so much to Bridget and Rob. And I'm not quite sure how we clap our hands in this, but maybe we could just put up our hands like this, and we're very, very, very pleased that you were able to do this. Thank you very, very much. Okay, thank you. I'll hand back to Barbara.